I climbed out of the basket of deplorables to welcome you to the unknown webcast. By way of reminder, I am so conservative that I have trouble turning left when I'm driving. This is broadcaster number 29, and our friend Dr. E. Calvin Beisner is joining us on this edition of the Unknown Webcast. Tonight, we are going to talk about the art of manipulation and climate change. My name is Don Vino, and I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of tonight's webcast.
Greetings from the lightning capital of the United States, stormy and sometimes sunny Florida. Our sponsors this evening for the Unknown Webcast include World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop destination for dubious doctrines, half-baked heresies, and other notions whose time is gone. World's End Theology Outlet, and Carbona Resorts and Spas, the investment opportunity of the new climate world. Carbona Resorts and Spas. Okay, back to you guys.
Okay. Dr. Beisner, we are so glad you're back with us again tonight, and we're going to be taking a little bit different slant on the topic of climate change. Not so much about the science, but you might recall we did an article a few weeks back called The Art of Manipulation, and talked about the book by Kafka, The Trial, in which a sort of low-level bureaucrat was arrested, never actually charged with anything, but always it was just implied that he had done something wrong, and the more he denied it, the more guilty he became. Eventually, he was convicted and executed without the benefit of actually producing evidence. And then I noticed, I think it was this past week, you all had posted a review, which is on LifeSite, on a new book titled, what is the title of this book? Hubris, the troubling science, economics, and politics of climate change.
Yes.
I haven't read the book, read the review, thought it was well done. Where do we begin?
Well, I have a question. Does anybody in the climate change community read books like this? I mean, are we just publishing to the choir here, or are these given a hearing anywhere?
Well, the book itself actually won a significant award in Canada for science education writing, and the author of it is a well-known professor at Carleton University in Canada. He's got a long background, particularly in international treaty negotiations with the Canadian government. And so he's pretty well known. And as a result, I think this book is likely to get a little bit more attention than a lot of other books by so-called climate skeptics. Yeah, some of the people go ahead and read these. Many people don't. They're afraid to see the other side. That's kind of one of the benefits of being in the majority, whether the majority is real or only fake, as is the case in this instance. If you're in the majority, then you don't have to read the critics, because obviously the consensus tells the truth, and people who disagree are out to lunch. You know, they don't really know how to think. You don't need to answer them. It's kind of like the Darwinians on evolution. They refuse to debate creationists because to do so is to admit the legitimacy of creationist thinking. Of course, to do so is also to open themselves up to the possibility of refutation. Well, the same kind of thing goes on in the climate wars.
Yeah, you know, it's funny you should mention that. Karl Barth was famous for refusing to debate Cornelius Van Til,
yes,
and other critics of his. And as a result, I think as an indirect or maybe direct result, you know, you have people today who just say, well, Van Til, you know, his he just didn't know what he was talking about. But there was never any interaction, and we see this over and over again. And you're right. There's something about the comfort of the consensus. We use it as a little security blanket. We can always take refuge in, well, the vast majority. Well, you know, you've heard that 97%. Was that the last statistic?
Consensus. Yeah, the claim is 97%. Actually, the most recent major study on which that claim was based, actually, if you carefully examined the raw data, you found that the consensus that they discovered was all of about 0.3%, rather
well, you know,
than 7%.
If you count ornithologists and you know, ichthyologists and all those as people who really know about climate science,
well, I mean, that would be doing really well, because there you would at least be counting natural scientists. This counted authors of articles on psychology, authors of articles on sociology and things like that, and how people were responding to the fears of climate change. Counted people like that. But besides that, it counted articles as supporting the so-called consensus view of dangerous man-made warming driven by CO2 emissions. It counted articles as supporting that if they simply didn't take any particular position about it. They assumed that they're supporting.
silence is agreement in science now.
Sure, that's it.
Oh,
and of course, all of this is to completely neglect the fact that consensus is not a scientific value. Consensus is a political value. You want to know who won an election, you count votes. If you want to know how much an addition of CO2 is going to warm the atmosphere, you don't count votes. You do the physics. You do the empirical observation. That's a very different thing from counting votes.
You know, it's funny. I was thinking about climate change this week when I read an article in Real Clear Science about how in the middle of the 20th century, the dominant cosmological theory of origins was the steady-state theory.
Yes.
And it was the idea that matter just kind of spontaneously emerges, which was, you know, you could say it was kind of loosely based on quantum theory. If a single hydrogen atom per every cubic meter of space emerged out of nowhere every second, it would be enough to keep the universe going, you know. But you know, it's been totally abandoned now. It was a very precipitous abandonment. It was when they discovered the microwave background radiation. You know, within a few years of that discovery, several follow-up observations were made, and nobody hardly, I don't know of anybody who believes in steady state theory anymore, but it was the consensus. It was the reigning paradigm for the 1930s, 40s, 50s.
Yeah, well, anybody who thinks that consensus determines what is real science, what is true science, anything like that, shows himself to be completely ignorant of the history of science, because it is loaded with ideas that were once the consensus of all the scientists and then got demolished,
proven wrong, right? Which brings up for me, when we started on this tract of consensus, isn't that in itself even sort of manipulative language?
Oh, sure, because nobody wants to be in the tiny minority, you know.
Well, that's right. It implies we're the tiny minority, the uneducated, the uninformed. In my case, a knuckle dragger in the basket of deplorables. Yes. And therefore I have nothing of value.
Are you trying to tip us off on something you're going to vote for this November, Don? Are you trying to?
No, I'm not doing that. I find, you know, I thought the title of that book, Hubris, was perfect, because I find that those, in this argument, for example, we see this in other areas, that have virtually no legitimate evidence to support their view, advance it by manipulative language, by false accusations, to demonize any who may even question what they're saying.
Yeah. And you know, a lot of your listeners might think when they first hear you say, there's virtually no real evidence to support this view, namely the view that human activity and burning fossil fuels is driving dangerous man-made warming. They're going to think, really? Virtually no evidence? I mean, after all these scientists think this. Surely they have evidence. Well, unfortunately, there's a confusion between what is evidence and what is hypothesis or theory. And people have come to think of computer models of how something works as if they were evidence. But in reality, computer models are simply a sophisticated way of showing what your theory is, what you would predict is going to happen in whatever it is you're talking about, whether it's the atmosphere or the oceans or a crop field or a jet engine or whatever else. A model is a sophisticated way of trying to describe what you think will happen if you take such and such an action with regard to that system. The model's output is not evidence. It is itself the expression of the hypothesis. The evidence is the real-world observations. It's your laboratory experiments. It's what you observe when you go out into the rainforest or into the tundra or whatever. That's evidence. And the models are what tell us that adding CO2 to the atmosphere is going to cause dangerous warming. But the empirical observation tells us something very different, because on average, the models predict 2 to 3 times as much warming as actually has been observed in the relevant period. 95% of them predict more warming than actually observed, which means that the errors are not random, but driven by some sort of bias, because if they were random, they would as often predict less warming than actually observed. And finally, none of the models predicted the complete absence of all global, statistically significant global warming from early 1997 to late 2015, a period of about 18 years and 9 months. That is completely irreconcilable with the notion that the models accurately depict how the climate system works. So the evidence is the empirical observation. The models are the hypotheses, and you test the hypotheses by observation. And unfortunately, we now have a whole generation of scientists who have been trained up doing modeling almost all the time and rarely doing empirical observation.
So, of course, modeling is all about presuppositions. It's
Yes.
So if they don't do empirical observations and they program a model, where's the data coming from? Where are they getting this data? Because you have to have data to have a model, right?
Yeah. Some data are reasonably derived from empirical observation. We have some data in terms of atmospheric temperatures, oceanic temperatures, things like that. We have some data regarding the expanse of sea ice, of land ice, glaciers, things like that. We have some data regarding historical temperatures and so on. So we can feed those data in. The quality of the data is highly questionable. I mean, until we started measuring atmospheric temperature from satellites, so that we actually get 24/7, 365, all latitudes, all longitudes, all altitudes measurements, we had hopelessly unrepresentative samples of temperature. And so that means anything before 1979, our understanding of what the temperature was is far less sure, less precise, less certain than our understanding of what it's been since the satellite period began. So you've got some data, but mostly you just have theory. You have theory as to how much warming will come from adding CO2. You plug that into the model, and of course the model gives you the results that would predict. But you don't trust those results because they're not data. Model results are not data at all. They are hypotheses, so you have to compare them with real-world observation.
Right.
And you're saying that we hardly have any real-world observations to go on at the moment?
Well, not quite that. in terms of global atmospheric temperatures, we actually have some very, very good data. The two best sources are satellites on the one hand and weather balloons on the other. Now, the reason that those are best, first of all, is that they avoid contamination by what's called urban heat island effect. And then second, they tend to be much more comparable over time because you don't have as much variety of instrumentation, of placement, of how the housing of the sensing instrument was constructed and placed.
Fewer variables, in other words.
Yeah, far fewer variables. And the satellite measurements are far and away the best, far better than weather balloons, although in fact the data sets are extremely similar between those two. But the satellite are the best because they are the most comprehensive. There's very little selectivity of where you get the information. It's, as I said, all latitudes, all longitudes, all altitudes, 24/7, 365. So that's the best data that we have.
Isn't it true that, well, it just seems, this is my impression, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in the 80s and 90s, you had a lot of ground-based data that was being used.
Still do.
And, oh, you still do? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And the ground-based data, the urban heat sinks, I mean, I saw a program even back in the 90s where a man had a very scientific temperature sensor, one that was designed to give extremely, it looked like a tricorder actually from Star Trek. He was carrying it around in Salt Lake City, Utah.
Yeah.
And he stepped, and this was like on a regular broadcast, and he was showing how urban heat sinks work. He walked over to a grassy area, took a temperature reading, then he walked over to a parking lot, and it was vastly different.
Yeah.
And he was actually explaining how these urban heat sinks work, and yet you look at all these ground-based stations, and where are they? They're in urban heat sinks.
Yeah. Well, in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NASA, the National Climate Data Center, all of these have rules about how you're supposed to situate temperature monitoring stations, what kind of instrumentation you're to use, how that instrumentation is to be housed, because you can't put it in direct sunlight because that won't give you a true reading. So it has to be in shade, but it can't be over blacktop. It can't be near, the heat exhaust of an air conditioning system, anything like that.
Oh, gee.
And the problem is that these situations, the sites of these change over time. Not that the instrument is moved from one place to another, but that as urban areas grow, they come to encompass these things. And a really fascinating set of studies done by Anthony Watts of whatsupwiththat.com.
Oh, yes, he's a great guy.
A whole bunch of volunteers with him. They went around and took photographs of the actual temperature sensing instrumentation all around the country. That was, these were the official sources of the data for NOAA and NASA, et cetera. And what they found was that over 80% of them failed completely to comply with the proper criteria for siting of temperature monitoring instruments.
But Dr. Beisner, by requiring, by asking scientists to reduce their variables, and by asking them to provide more consistent data and observe all these protocols, aren't we just being anti-science? I mean, really, aren't we?
Exactly the opposite. We are being pro-science.
But that's what we're being accused of. I mean, when we look at them and we're being told that by asking them to adhere to the protocols of the scientific method, we're anti-science. We're the anti-science one.
Well, that's exactly the kind of manipulation that Don was talking about earlier, is that the folks on the alarmist side in this conversation manipulate people by using labels. They'll label you a denier of global warming, a denier of science, a denier of data, and so on. and of course the very term denier is meant to liken you to a
Right.
Holocaust denier.
And it's not always implicit. It has been done explicitly. There was
absolutely.
a columnist who explicitly said,
Right.
if you are a climate change denier, you are just as despicable as a Holocaust denier. And
Yeah.
So you can't.
You are
you
as
can't have-
despicable as a Holocaust denier.
That's my paraphrase, but that's the message everybody got from what she said. It was a female columnist. I forget her name now. So they've gone on record as saying that no, you cannot legitimately hold another opinion about this. And now there are even talks of prosecuting people for holding the view.
Yeah. You have the Attorneys General United for Clean Power, which has run into some problems. The U.S. Virgin Islands Attorney General issued subpoenas to ExxonMobil Corporation and the Competitive Enterprise Institute, demanding over a decade's worth of communications related to climate change research and publication and so on. They wound up having, the U.S. Virgin Islands Attorney General wound up having to withdraw those subpoenas because, frankly, he didn't have any legal authority to have issued them, and he was clearly on a fishing expedition, which you're not supposed to do with subpoenas. The other Attorney General who's really been pushing all this, Eric Schneiderman of New York, has actually wound up raising huge criticism on the part of the other members of Attorneys General United for Clean Power, because they're seeing that he has stepped out on a limb without good solid evidence to begin with. The whole thing is falling apart. And then another group of attorneys general came out and rebuked them for doing this, essentially politicizing the issue, and said, look, what really is happening here is you are abusing your power as attorneys general, and you are undermining the rights of free speech and freedom of the press. And as it turns out, U.S. Code, 18 U.S. Code, Section 241, makes doing that a felony, punishable by up to 10 years in prison plus a significant monetary fine. So those attorneys general are backing off now, and the whole thing seems to be falling apart.
The Attorneys General Club won't let them get prosecuted, I don't think.
The Attorney General Club. Friends and relatives of the Attorneys General will not allow the prosecution.
I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, and we had a similar thing. Was it Joe Biden? Maybe I forget who it was. Maybe someone of that caliber, at least, said that the global warming is of more danger than terrorism is.
Yeah, Biden was in a meeting a couple of months ago. First, he had a meeting with leading officials from a variety of different countries discussing how to respond to ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations, how to minimize the threat of terrorism. And then, shortly after that, he was in Vienna, Austria, in a meeting of various government leaders talking about climate change and how to reduce that, how to mitigate that. And he told them that what they were doing was every bit as important, in fact, even more important than what the negotiators about fighting terrorism were doing. The absurdity of that is just amazing, because as a matter of fact, there's no evidence that climate change so far has killed anybody. But just in terms of the Syrian civil war, there have been some 500,000 casualties there. And that doesn't even start looking at all of the casualties in Iraq and Iran and Kurdistan and so on that are driven by the uprisings that are going on.
But those are caused by climate change. Didn't we find that out, that the Syrian civil war? Hasn't that been scientifically proven that all the world's problems trace back to climate change?
Yeah, you had the claim all right. In fact, you even had an admiral, a retired admiral, who backed the claim, and he, by the way, is a climatologist as well as a U.S. Navy admiral. But
he's a real climatologist.
Yeah, a real climatologist. The problem, though, is this: that the long-term data over the last century show no significant warming for the Fertile Crescent, which includes Syria. They show no significant changes in precipitation. There's no climate change been going on there. So what they've got is an effect without a cause. And of course, they're completely forgetting that the causes of the Syrian civil war and the whole conflict among the various different Muslim factions in the Middle East, those causes go back literally centuries, 6, 8, 10 centuries from now, and they have nothing to do with climate. They have everything to do with ideology.
Well, or lack of jobs. I mean, depending on what day of the week it is, we can either say it's lack of jobs, climate change, but we can't.
Or midnight basketball.
Midnight basketball? Could that cause the problem?
But of course, one of the more recent ones, of course, was what shut down the London, was it Heathrow or Gatwick Airport last week? Did you all follow that one?
I did not.
Oh yeah. The English chapter of Black Lives Matter has decided that climate change is a racist issue because, according to them, Black Africans, sub-Saharan Africa, being poor, are going to be hurt more by climate change than whites around the world who are rich, and therefore climate change is driven by racism. And so a bunch of these folks chained themselves together on the runway of one of the big airports in London and shut down all flights for several hours, causing all sorts of mishap. But of course, the reality is that the poverty that people in sub-Saharan Africa experience is far greater risk to their health and safety than anything having to do with climate. Poverty brings with it high rates of disease and premature death that far outstrip anything in terms of climate. So even if the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change were right as to how much warming it says you get from our adding CO2 to the atmosphere, its own studies by Working Group 3 in each of its assessment reports, which come out about every 5 or 6 years, its own studies indicate that the poorest countries in the world today will be best off in the warmest scenarios of the future because what drives the warming for those scenarios is economic development. And economic development protects these people from all the different things that seem, that supposedly are related to climate change, whether it's access to water, food access, sanitation access, disease control, all these things. All of those things are solved by wealth, not by changes in climate.
Well, and in those settings, in many of those countries, correct me if I'm wrong, you're maybe more internationally astute than I am. It seems to me most of those issues, though, revolve around who's in control of the government, not how warm it may or may not be. In other words, the U.S., for example, has sent literally trillions of dollars in aid to these respective governments to help them in economic development and so forth, which goes to the leaders who get very large bank accounts but never seems to make it to the population.
Yeah, mostly in Switzerland, by the way, those bank accounts, because they're not safe in their own countries. Yeah. U.S. foreign aid does a whole lot to lift people out of poverty. Very few people, but way out of poverty. It makes them billionaires who then have plenty of money to take care of themselves when their people finally rise up and drive them out, these thugs. But as a matter of fact, U.S. foreign aid has no significant positive benefit to the poor in these other countries. Wonderful recent film is called Poverty, Inc. That's I-N-C period, not I-N-K. We're not all of it, but Poverty, Inc. And it's a great documentary critique of the whole foreign aid industry, not only by governments, but also by most private philanthropic enterprises, including, I'm sad to say, an awful lot of Christian mission organizations that do more harm than good by their attempts to alleviate poverty in the developing world. So Poverty Inc. is a great documentary to see on that. And there's also a marvelous book called Dead Aid by Dambisa Moyo, a Zambian economist, formerly with the World Bank and Oxford University. And she just points out the data are very, very clear. The places that receive the most foreign aid are the places that have the least economic development. The places that receive the least foreign aid are the places that develop the best. The reason is that the foreign aid takes away the incentive for entrepreneurship, for wealth creation, and it solidifies the hold of corrupt, powerful oligarchs in those countries.
Well,
I saw an article about 15 or 20 years ago now, just as you're talking about that, it reminded me of a number of Africans with a big sign that said, "Please stop helping us."
Yes.
And the entire article was devoted to exactly the concept that you're talking about, is that it's taking away the incentive for entrepreneurship. It's taking away the creativity of those who could actually start and build an economy. And instead is causing us to continue to be reliant on you and not to grow our economies.
Well, but the standard argument that you hear when we've been pumping money into something and it hasn't worked is the reason it hasn't worked is because we haven't pumped enough money into it.
Yeah, well, that argument might have a little bit of credibility, except that what the data show is the places that do the best are the places which we give the least.
Well, there you go.
The data show exactly the opposite.
But we won't include that in our data, though. We'll just leave that out.
There goes your computer modeling again, getting in the way. The model doesn't reflect reality. Ron, do we have a word from, speaking of modeling, from our resort sponsors, maybe?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned it because I don't know about you, but I could really, really use a break. When you see images like this, what do you think of? Vacation, fun, relaxation, time away with family. Well, here are two words you should be thinking. Cha-ching. Because any day now, the Arctic beaches of Canada, Alaska, Greenland, and Northern Europe will all look like this, making this the investment opportunity of a lifetime. Work will soon be starting on our new chain of Carbona resorts and spas. Contact Oxgore Industries today for a free investment prospectus at 1-800-CLIMATE. Carbona Resorts and Spas, the investment opportunity of the new climate world. Well, you got to make money somehow, right?
Well, that's right. And places that are currently inland will soon become beachfront property if the climate models actually work.
And we're just not making money off of carbon credits. So I think this is a surefire solution.
Yeah, I hate to rain on the parade there, but let me give you some idea of what we're really talking about here. I live, Ron, you live in North Florida, right?
No, Southwest. Okay. I live in Southwest.
Oh, where?
Cape Coral.
Oh, okay. Well, then you're similar to me. I live down in right near Miami. Now, I'm 17 miles from the beach and 8 feet above sea level. Now, I ran the calculations about a year ago as to how long it would take for sea level to reach the slab of my house, to go up those 8 feet. According to the data given, or rather the predictions made, that's not data, that's predictions, made by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as to how rapidly the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets would melt, driven by man-made climate change. I ran the numbers, and I discovered that my house would turn into a beach house in a little under 6,000 years.
Really? Well, the funny thing is, when we
I'm not sure that your Carbona enterprise is really going to pay off all that soon.
Well, it'll pay off for us, at least.
Well, that's the idea. It's going to pay off for Oxgore Industries.
Oh, that's the deal. Sucker board.
It's whose ox is gored. In any case, it's funny you should bring this up because when we moved down here, it was 2002. And that was pretty much the peak in my experience, the peak shrillness and loudness that I recall of the whole climate change debate. I remember that I heard George W. Bush doubting the science behind climate change at that time, even as he was running it, and the Tokyo protocols were a big issue and all that. And I just remember thinking, I thought W was out of his mind, because I'd been listening to climate change propaganda for over a decade, and I was pretty convinced that it was real. And I was thinking, what am I doing moving to Florida? The latest articles I read put me underwater within just a few decades. I'm thinking, how am I going to sell my house? Who's going to want it?
Yeah.
I was literally thinking this. I was really thinking this was very real to me, very personal. And it was only gradually as...
Ron, you could have taken a lesson from Al Gore, who bought a condominium in a building that is right on the waterfront in San Francisco. He apparently didn't think that sea level rise was going to happen as fast as he was saying in his film, An Inconvenient Truth.
Gee, do you think? Well, anyways, it was gradually as I became educated on this, I began to think, whoa, wait a minute. I've been duped. I was back in the 70s. I was worried I was going to die from air pollution, water pollution, nuclear war, biological war, you name it. I was going to.
And a glacier covering Chicago.
Yeah, right. I should have died 10 times by now. It was all going to happen by the year 2000, and once again, they had me thinking, okay, I'm doomed. And I'm just sick and tired of it. I'm sorry, you could call me whatever you want, anti-science, a denier. I'm not going to be a moron anymore and be a dupe. I'm sorry.
Well, what you've just put your finger on really is the manipulation kind of techniques. All of it centers on engendering fears in the population at large. And those fears become the motivation for us to yield control of more and more of our lives to the anointed few who understand how to straighten everything out so that we can survive. And the fears were of global cooling back in the 60s and 70s. We were told this is being caused by industry being out of control. The market is out of control. It needs to be put under control. Give us control. And in the 80s and 90s, when it turned to fears of global warming, we were told this is caused by industry out of control. The market is out of control. It needs to be put under control. Put us in control. Same people, same solution to the opposite problem. And it's been the same thing with fears of rapid deforestation, rainforest deforestation. The same thing with fears of rapid species extinction. The same thing with fears of overpopulation, with fears of famine, other things of that sort. None of these things materializes, but they're used to drive people to the fear that allows them to, or that drives them to put control of their lives in other people's hands. And that's what you get with people who like to control other people.
And the fears are largely based on undefined claims. Now, global cooling was more clearly defined. Okay, it's going to get colder. We're going to have a new ice age. It's going to come all the way down into the Midwest. You might as well move to Florida or farther south because everything will be covered with ice. You won't even be able to see the Sears Tower. It is going to be so much ice in the way, which then changed to global warming. Now, that's, again, a little more specific. We're going to burn to death. You could get SPF 1000 and you're still not going to help you because the sun is going to be so hot, you're just going to shrivel up and die. Well, that didn't really work out. So in order to keep the fears going, what did they do? They made it an amorphous term, climate change. What does that mean?
Well, climate change is the cool term or the hot term, take your pick, precisely because just as in Kafka's The Trial, there were no clearly defined charges. Remember, in that wonderful novel, the poor guy didn't know what it was he was supposed to have done wrong. So therefore, he didn't know what he was supposed to defend against in terms of the charges. And that's what goes on with climate change. Now, I do have to admit that there hasn't been as much of a switch from global warming to climate change in the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as there has been in the mainstream media and among politicians. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was started in 1989 or 90 with that very name, Intergovernmental Panel, not on global warming, but on climate change. And its charter was to study human influence on climate change. Of course, if you tell them to study only human influence, that obviously means they're not going to be studying natural, non-human influences like cycles in the sun, cycles in the oceans, cycles in the solar system, and so on. But that's, beside the point. I mean,
now would any of those things actually have any influence on climate change?
Pardon?
Would any of those things you just named actually have any influence on climate change?
Oh, absolutely, and a much greater influence than human activity. But at any rate, they had the name on climate change right from the start. It was the more popularizers, like Al Gore, who insisted on talking so constantly about global warming, and that put the whole thing at risk. Because if you're talking about global warming and then you go for a while without any warming, all at once your fear disappears, and then your rationale for all of these super expensive solutions disappears. So little by little, they needed to harness the popularizers, the Gores and the media reporters and so on, and get them back onto the proper agenda using climate change instead of global warming as the terminology.
So how do they use and I like the term Kafka trapping. Now, we talk about it in our article, The Art of Manipulation, which is available on our blog, www.midwestoutreach.org. I like the term Kafka trapping because it sort of is descriptive about what we're talking about here. Using manipulative language to distract you from the actual issue, if there is one, to some non-real issue in order to gain power. That's really what it's all about.
Yeah.
So how do they do this with, say, discussion on using coal in the manufacture of electricity?
Well, what they'll do, one example of how they do that is, you've heard, of course, how we're all supposed to make sure that we have a small carbon footprint, and they'll talk about carbon pollution as if what the coal-fired power plants were putting out was carbon. Now, in truth, it's not carbon, it's carbon dioxide. But when people hear about carbon, they get the idea of black, sooty stuff. The kind of stuff that when you breathe it in, it hurts your lungs. It's bad for you, right?
Industrial Revolution grade.
Yeah, right. Long before we learned how to put scrubbers on the smokestack so that you don't actually have any smoke coming out. Carbon dioxide is not carbon. Carbon is an element, just one atom. Carbon dioxide is a compound, 3 atoms, 1 atom of carbon, 2 atoms of oxygen. And carbon dioxide is an odorless, colorless, non-toxic gas. In a typical room, a gathering of people, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the air will typically be around 2,000 parts per million. That is about 5 times the average concentration around the world right now, 400 parts per million. And the U.S. Navy tries to keep the concentration on submarines below about 7,000 parts per million. But even at that level, the sailors, the submariners, can function very, very well without any difficulty for months on end. So we're not talking about any real pollution here. But the other side speaks of carbon emissions instead of carbon dioxide emissions as part of how it confuses people. It raises specters of black, sooty stuff, when in reality we're talking about odorless, colorless, non-toxic gas. So that's one way that they tend to do this. And then they say, well, and coal is the highest emitter of carbon emissions when you burn it to create electricity. Therefore, we need to stop using coal. Well, the fact is that those carbon emissions are not carbon, they're CO2, and that more carbon dioxide in the air, it has a very, very slight warming effect, probably too small to detect. but it has a different effect, very, very clearly detectable effect. That is, it enhances plant growth efficiency. For every doubling of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, you can get an average 35% increase in plant growth efficiency. Plants grow better in warmer and colder temperatures, in wetter and drier soils. They make better use of soil nutrients. They defend better against pests and diseases, and they improve their fruit to fiber ratio. And the result of that is more food for everything that eats plants and everything that eats something that eats plants, which means everything alive. It's win-win-win. It's very, very good stuff. And what it does is it increases crop yields around the world, making food less expensive, which is best for the poor around the world.
But
So
Dr. Beisner,
it's deceptive.
by going around and pointing out all the benefits of carbon dioxide, aren't you just destroying the planet? Isn't that all you're... I mean, this is what it always gets turned around on us. It's like you can itemize all these things, and then the headline. It's like if Cal Beisner, walked on water, the headline would be Cal Beisner can't swim. So if Cal Beisner itemizes the benefits of carbon dioxide, then Cal Beisner is trying to destroy the planet. I mean, it's
yeah, that's the accusation, and frankly, it's just silliness, because as a matter of fact, more CO2 in the atmosphere makes everything grow better. It's greening the planet. In fact, our satellite photography, running from the early 1960s right up to the present, the satellite photography shows that vegetation density all around the world has been rising right along with CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, and the deserts have been shrinking. Plant growth has been encroaching on desert land precisely because there's more CO2 in the atmosphere. If we want a verdant earth, if we want to enhance the fruitfulness of the earth, we want more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. As a matter of fact, plants are basically sucking air at below 300 parts per million of carbon dioxide, and that's where we were before the Industrial Revolution. You get down below 200 parts per million, and most photosynthesis ceases, and the whole Earth dies.
Wow. Well, this is something I heard. I still listen to NPR. I mean, I listen to all sources.
National People's Radio.
Yeah, the People's Republic Radio. Yeah.
Yes.
I listen, until I, feel like I'm going to go insane sometimes, but
Yes.
they have good jazz and classical sometimes. But in any case,
your tax dollars at work.
Yeah, really. I mean, when you think about it, I might as well get, they're asking me for money, and I'm thinking, aren't you already getting my money? So the thing is, I remember before the politics of this got really shrill with Al Gore, hearing them interview scientists in the 90s, and one of them pointed out that that climate change, they're talking about global warming, it will have benefits. Think of all that farmland in Canada that will now be useful, and it will solve world hunger. It will reduce poverty, all these amazing things that I thought, at that time I thought, bring it on. And then I moved to Florida and thought, wait a minute, I'm going to be underwater. Yeah. So I went through emotional swings over this issue.
Right. Now, you just raised another issue, and that is the distribution of the warming that is caused by a rise in CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. The modeling that the IPCC depends on to drive the fears of global warming tells them that warming is primarily in winter, at night, toward the polar regions, not in summer during the daytime in the temperate or subtropical or tropical zones. In other words, it's happening right where it is most needed. And the result is an expansion of the regions that can grow crops, a lengthening of the crop year. You get freezes ending, the last frost comes earlier in the year. The first frost comes later in the year. So you have more time for crops to grow. It's all really good news. And unfortunately, most of the global warming alarmist crowd simply swept that information under the rug. But that's according to their own models.
Part of this manipulative thing too is we're talking. I started thinking about all of just the discussions I have had with, friends and family, different people, acquaintances, about winters and summers in our childhood past, the lazy, hazy days of summer, or the severely cold winters. And sometimes I lived in Chicago in 1967. I don't know if you're aware of this, but we had like 22 inches of snowfall over one 24-hour period. Remember that? You look on the news and you see everyone just got out of the cars on the Eisenhower Expressway and walked away because they couldn't go anywhere. Yep. And so we tend to think of our winters as that way, but that wasn't normative. Well, and yet that's how the climate manipulators persuade us about warmth. You think of the 1967 winter and you go, you don't really have winters like that anymore. Well, we mostly didn't have winters like that.
Yeah, well, global average temperature rises and falls in a number of cycles of different lengths. Those cycles are driven by the sunspot cycle, which roughly averages about 11 years, and the cycles in the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, several other ocean current cycles, and Pacific Decadal Oscillation runs at about 30 years to flip from positive to negative. Positive warms the world, negative cools the world. Similar situation for the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation. And then, of course, there's the El Nino and La Nina Southern Oscillation that warms and cools the Earth as well. That runs anywhere from 6 or 8 years to 15 or 20 years in length. Those are fairly short cycles. And then there are longer cycles running about 1,500 years long, and longer than the cycles than that, appearing in terms of conventional geology to run 140,000 years long. All these different natural cycles exist. Now, you mentioned the 1960s. The 1960s were the coldest decade of the 20th century for the 48 contiguous states of the United States.
Really?
Like you, I lived in an area where we could seriously experience that. I lived in southern upstate New York, a rural area near the Pennsylvania line, and in 1965, might have been 64, we had a blizzard on Easter Day, which is fairly late in the year to have a big blizzard.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. That blizzard dumped so much snow on our area atop a hill in southern New York that we couldn't get out of our ground floor doors or windows of our house. We had to climb out the second-story windows onto the snow, and there was still snow in the ravines where the sun didn't penetrate on July 4 of that year. But that was the 60s. The warmest decade for the continental United States of the 20th century was the 1930s. It had more high-temperature records than any other decade, and most of those records still stand. Certainly far warmer than the late 1990s.
Well, my grandfather would he talked about that toward the end of his life. He really remembered the heat waves that came, and of course that was the decade of the Dust Bowl.
Exactly. Yeah.
Were you near the Great Lakes? Was any of that lake effect blizzard?
No, we were down near the Pennsylvania line, about halfway east-west between New York City and the Ohio state line.
Okay.
If you know the area of the Finger Lakes, we were south of that. So we didn't get the lake effect, at least not very much. A little bit would come down the Susquehanna Valley, but not much.
Well,
we may have had that same thing in Chicago, because I remember around Easter time one year in the 1960s that we had snow, and it seemed unusual. But
yeah.
Well, think of the 1978. Was it the not really a blizzard, but it was 88 inches of snowfall that stayed on the ground, and got Jane Byrne elected mayor of Chicago because they couldn't clear the streets. Well, that was all over the Chicago area, and they in Lombard. Don, you'll remember this, over what was the Jewel Osco. I forget. Well, anyways, they piled that whole parking lot. They took all the snow from all the side streets in Lombard, piled it up there, and it was a mountain of snow, and it was still there in the month of May that year.
Yeah. Well, in front of our house, because I lived on Main Street in Lombard at the time,
right?
That 88 inches of snow was piled up in front of my house, of course, as the plows went by, and our dog, we had a German Shepherd, would go and stand on top of that and look down at traffic. In fact, we had to put big orange balls on our antennas. Remember, we used to have antennas on our cars back in the olden days, so that when you pulled out of your driveway, people could see that something was going on there.
The Union 76 ball. Well, listen, have we covered the all of the onion layers of deception that the author mentioned in his book?
Let me raise another one, and I addressed this one in a major article that I published a couple of months ago called "Climate Science, Energy Policy, Poverty, and Christian Faith: How Do They Connect?" This was actually a lecture that I delivered at Penn State, the Pennsylvania State University, back in I think it was March. And it interacted with an article in Forbes magazine by astrophysicist Ethan Siegel called "The Next Great Global Warming Hiatus is Coming." And one of the things that I pointed out in this article of mine, which is available on Cornwall Alliance's website, cornwallalliance.org, is the way Siegel and many other global warming alarmists, and frankly, alarmists of all sorts, use graphs to show data. I wish that I could show it here, but I don't have the technical know-how to do that kind of thing over the program here, but people can go to cornwallalliance.org and look for that article. But Siegel started out with a couple of really scary-looking graphs. One showing that that during the first half of March, most of North America was about a little more than 4 degrees Celsius warmer than the 1981 to 2010 average, and it was dominated by red, a scary color, red, right? And then the next graph that he used was a graph of the entire world showing that for December of 2015 through February of 2016, the surface temperature of much of the world was warmer than at any time in the previous 67 years. And again, he's got all of these reds all over the place. Now, if you were to turn either of those graphs to grayscale, you would depict exactly the same data, but you would take out the emotional alarm created by the red color. And that was one example of the kind of manipulation that climate alarmists use. They present data in the scariest possible way, and it's purely a psychological technique. Take that psychological scare out, and then you can begin to speak much more objectively about these things. But objective speech is exactly what these folks don't want to have.
Right. What was the name of that article again?
The article, my article, is "Climate Science, Energy Policy, Poverty, and Christian Faith: How Do They Connect?" And it's on our website, cornwallalliance.org.
Okay. So people can go look at that and actually see the graphs as you explain what they're doing.
Yes.
Why do you think, Dr. Beisner, why do you think we never learn? We never learn. We let these people, these alarmists, scare us, these Chicken Littles, the sky is falling. I remember watching the Smothers Brothers, they basically, eventually they got booted from CBS because they got too political. But I remember one time listening to Tommy and Dickie Smothers talk about if current population rates keep going, by the end of the century, there will be 10 people for every square yard or something like, it was some ridiculous prediction that we were going to be so overcrowded that we would be like that Star Trek episode where they find this planet where everybody's just squished together because of overpopulation. And, there was that, there was nuclear war, there were all these things that were supposed to destroy us that people were literally, I mean, I saw people weep on Oprah Winfrey over some of this stuff. They're genuinely scared.
Why do we never learn? Well, I think there
we
are
never learn.
A number of different possible explanations. One of the simple ones is, well, as a matter of fact, a whole lot of people do learn, but they tend to do that as they get older and older, and then they die. And it takes time to learn. And when you're young, you haven't learned those things yet. So every new generation is a new target for the fearmongers to do this kind of manipulation. And by the time they get old enough to realize how manipulated they've been and to learn not to be manipulated that way, they're on their way out. That's where you and I are, right?
Yeah, one foot in the grave, the other foot in a banana peel,
Yeah. Another reason why people just don't learn is that that the scriptures tell us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, most of our country has lost the fear of the Lord. There is no fear of God, and since there's no fear of God, there is no knowledge, there's no wisdom. And that's what we need, as a restoration of the fear of God. And that's why we need so desperately for pastors around this country to be faithful in preaching the whole Word of God, both law and gospel. The law telling what God requires of us and warning of the punishments that come when we don't do it, and the gospel telling what God has done for us in Jesus Christ because we didn't perform what he requires of us by the law. That's, as pastors are faithful to preaching law and gospel together, we will see a revival of the fear of the Lord, and with the revival of the fear of the Lord, there will come a revival of wisdom and knowledge, and people won't be so easily misled by these manipulation techniques.
So what was that promise that God gave to Noah?
Genesis 8:22. Yeah, Genesis 8:22. As long as earth endures.
While the earth remains. Yeah. Go ahead, say it. I'm looking at it.
As long as the earth endures, summer and winter, cold and heat, day and night, seed time and harvest will not cease. That's God's promise, and that uses a bit of Hebrew poetic structure called merism, taking opposite ends of spectrums. And the idea is, these and everything in between. The message is all the cycles on which life depends on this earth will continue as long as the earth itself continues. And it is God himself who's promised himself that, and who is going to make certain of it by his omnipotent power.
Yeah. It's a promise of regularity, predictability, lack of world-consuming catastrophes, such as the one that had just been experienced. And people don't believe that. People consistently refuse to believe that God will keep that promise.
Yeah. Yep. All right, Ron, we are getting close to our wrap-up time here. So, Cal, I would like you to give the website again, and people that are viewing this, they really need to go and sign up for your e-letter that comes up pretty regularly, because you have some great resources in here.
Thank you. Yeah, cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org. Sign up for our email newsletter. Read our hundreds of articles and dozens of papers there. But also, I'd really love for people to go to the website of our new documentary video, Where the Grass is Greener, Biblical Stewardship versus Climate Alarmism. And that video is available at wherethegrassisgreenerthemovie.com. That's wherethegrassisgreenerthemovie.com. In that, we have interviewed over 30 world-class scholars in the scientific, the economic, and the theological and ethical and political aspects of climate change and climate policy, energy policy, and the like. It's a tremendous documentary video, something that would be extremely useful in churches and schools, something you could share with public school teachers or with teachers at private schools to help them see another perspective on this than what the government tends to be pumping out in propaganda. Where the Grass is Greener, the movie.com.
Where the Grass is Greener, the movie. Okay. I'm gonna watch that. I'm gonna watch that first chance I get.
Okay.
Okay.
Why don't you walk us out of here? Roll the end credits, Ron.
Well, would you like to hear from our people, our friends at World's End Theology Outlet
Okay, do
before
that
we
and then roll
go?
the credits. How about that?
You found a verse in the Bible, you think it might be an error of science or history, or you found two verses in the Bible, you think they might contradict each other. How can you be sure? As sure as it's possible to be. Well, we have this week, this week only, the Bible Error Detector, the latest in Bible error detection technology, guaranteed right on the first try 50% of the time. The Bible Error Detector this week only at World's End Theology Outlet. And give me a second here. So, yeah, because you really want to be sure. Maybe that verse in Genesis isn't all that dependable. Who knows? So let's go to the end credits here. I have software getting in the way of other software. Here we go. All righty. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just in Case. Our Jehovah's Witnesses coverage is by Armageddon and D. Opposer. Our Mormon Archives manager is Polly Gummas. Our Liberal Denominations Bureau Chief is Lucy Goosey. Transgender issues coverage is handled by Ben Herb. Our special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Dehumanity. Fact-checking supervisor, Yoleg Pulling. Our technical assistance is handled by Murky Research. Our legal advisors come from the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Grievance Resolutions Director Yavana Pisami. Our Director of Privacy Assurance is wiretapping. Our original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc., in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, which are solely responsible for its content, although you cannot prove that in court. All right, are we done?
All right, Dr. Beisner, loved having you. We'll do this again in the future on another related topic to climate change and something else. Ron, it was fun as always. And we've been talking about, Dr. Beisner, we've been talking about doing maybe a little 5-minute little news piece in the beginning. We're going to maybe kick that off in the next few weeks once we figure out who to pick on first.
All right. All right. Well, thank you very much, brothers. Have a good night.
Thank you.
All right, have a good evening.
Thank you very much.